Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Mariah Meyer. I'm at Linköping University in Sweden, and I'd like to warmly welcome you to this session on visualization design methods. We have six really great and interesting papers coming up in this next session. I want to encourage you to post your questions in Slido, and just remember there's a bit of delay between the speakers presenting and the live stream, so do not wait to post your questions at the end. Post them when you think of them. So with that, I think we will hop right in. And the first talk in this session is going to be by Chase Stokes, and he's going to be presenting the paper, "It's a Good Idea to Put It into Words, Writing Rudders in the Initial Stages of Visualization Design."
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. I'm excited to be kicking off this very fun session. My name is Chase Stokes. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate at the School of Information at UC Berkeley. I'm advised by Marti Hearst, and today I'll be talking about some recent work we completed examining how visualization designers use writing within their design processes. So we completed this work with the help of Clara, who is a former master's student at the I School as well. So visualization designers often sketch or wireframe their designs. This step allows designers to experiment with different displays and to start to plan out their approach to the design. Sketching is also a key part of how we teach visualization design, particularly before students get familiar with visualization tools. While we know that sketching and wireframing can be useful, researchers have not explored the use of writing in the design process. And when I say writing, I mean literally the writing down of concepts, ideas, questions, or key points to make with the visualization. There are a few cases where language has been incorporated into design judgment, such as through learning objectives or design requirements, but those don't tend to incorporate designers in the design process itself quite as much. The closest idea we found was the use of a key message in the infographics design tool Epigraphics. So in this case, the text acted as a primary actor, guiding the design process and suggesting different design elements. And when we say design process, we're often thinking about this kind of nebulous activity where designers iterate and take nonlinear paths to their final designs. In this paper, we used the design activity framework to kind of better understand the stages of the design process. So in this study, we coined the term writing rudder to examine a specific use of writing in the design process. Here we focus on writing as a guide, like the rudder of a boat, that can help steer and assist the development of the visualization design. So this is writing that describes specifically the key message or the key goals, message, or story of the design. And we asked two main research questions in this work. So first, this is a relatively unexplored area, so we need to understand, do designers already do this? And if so, how? And then we also wanted to map out kind of what the effect of these writing rudders are. What is the impact of writing in the design process? And is it something we should recommend to designers as a possible step to take? We recruited US-based visualization designers who were fluent in English and designed visualizations as part of a paid role. And we used channels like the Data Visualization Society, as well as public posts to LinkedIn and X or Twitter. So for study one, 24 visualization designers completed a semi-structured interview. First, we collected some information through a pre-interview survey to give a sense of what kind of tools they used, what the context of their work was, and a little bit more about who they were. For the sake of time, I won't go through details, but you can find tons more information in the paper, or feel free to ask me after the talk. So this sample included 7 different domains of practice and multiple kinds of design outputs. Participants completed an interview during which we discussed their design process, including the specific tangible actions they took while designing a visualization. We also walked through an example design to kind of ground that discussion and get a better sense for the designer's typical output and context of work. And in the last section, we discussed things like their use of text elements specifically, like titles, captions, and annotations. We completed open coding of these transcripts and sorted our participants into one of 3 categories. So about 1/3 of participants did not use writing at all during their design process. It sort of never wrote anything down in written in language. Another third used writing in kind of an incidental way. So they would take notes during meetings or complete user interviews and use the transcripts, but they weren't seeing writing as a major step in their design process, nor did they use it as kind of a way to guide the design itself. And the rest of the participants did use writing the way we were looking for. It was a way for them kind of to guide the design process and to write down those key messages or stories. And the use of writing in any way tended to occur in those early stages of the design process, mostly when designers were getting a sense of the data, understanding their users, or starting to ideate on possible ideas and designs. So when we return to our research question, we can answer with 2 insights. First, we know that this is not a very common practice. 2/3 of our participants did not use writing as a concrete step in their design practice. But when designers do use writing rudders, they do so in kind of the early stages of the design process. So this starts to kind of set the stage and the groundwork for our second study. We wanted to know what the effect of these writing rudders are. So we looked back to the practices discussed in study 1 and extracted 4 examples of writing rudders to test. First, designers could write down key questions that a user or reader might come to the visualization to answer. They could also write down possible conclusions or takeaways that the reader might walk away from the design with. They could write a paragraph or a few sentences about the narrative or the story present in the data. or they could write down possible titles for their visualization. This practice was most common amongst data journalists in particular. For the second study, we recruited 15 participants using the same mechanisms and collected the same information using the pre-survey. The interview also began in the same way. So we had a concrete conversation with designers about their practices and approaches to visualization design. At this point, the protocol deviates and designers went on to complete a design exercise. So they were introduced to the writing rudder variants we were testing that I just discussed, selected the one they found most interesting or useful, and began their design process. The exercise itself only lasted about 10 minutes. So we were really interested in those early stages of design. We weren't necessarily wanting them to get all the way through the design itself. And in particular, they were given a year of Chicago weather data, including temperature, precipitation, and wind speed, and asked to help inform our marketing team when to deploy ads for waterproof windbreakers. These are the instructions they received, and they completed the writing step within the Google Sheet itself. And then when they went on to design or start their design process, they could use any design tool that they were most familiar with most participants going with Excel or Tableau. After they completed the exercise, we reflected on how it went, what the impact of the writing rudder was, if any, kind of what their thoughts were about that. And they also completed a post-interview survey in which they provided ratings for each variant for the different stages of the design process, including those early stages that we were really interested in. Overall, participants thought that the writing rudders would have a positive impact on their design process, with notable exceptions for narratives and titles. We completed open coding of these interviews as well to better understand what the impacts of these rudders were and why narratives and titles weren't really well suited to the design practice. So first, we looked at why designers preferred the question and conclusions approaches. Overall, these rudders added more focus to the design and got the designers thinking about the end goals or use cases of their design very early on. So by thinking about what the user might ask or take away, participants found that these approaches frequently centered the user experience and could be helpful in that area as well. So this participant mentions that they were surprised about how much it was a guide. They also mentioned later in this quote that they tend to go down design rabbit holes. And this sort of writing down of the questions and conclusions really helped kind of focus them in on what the output of the design was geared towards. And while we focus on the beginning stages of the design process, these rudders could also be useful for discussing the design's relative success. So one participant here describes a hypothetical conversation with a client in which they refer back to the original set of questions and try to determine whether those questions are answered in the design provided. And they discuss later kind of iterating on this process as well with the client. Now, the narratives and titles cause some concern among designers. So by stating what will happen or starting with the title in particular, designers were often concerned that they would be biasing the data exploration stage of the design. Instead, these steps would be better suited for later in the design process, particularly the narrative. So here, a participant discusses the use of a narrative as a guiding device for after the data exploration stage. So you've seen the trends in the data, and now you can kind of go on, write your story, and get a better sense of how to shape the storytelling component of the design without potentially biasing the data exploration stage. So let's return to our original research questions. We want to know if designers use writing and if it has any impact on the design process. Well, first, we know that designers really don't use writing that frequently. In study 2, even fewer designers use writing than in study 1. It's not a core part of how most designers think about their design process, nor a concrete step that they seem like they're aware of taking. But maybe it should be. The interventions were very lightweight. It took less than 10 minutes to complete, and most of the time were well received. They were seen as having a positive impact on multiple stages of the visualization design process. And in particular, this key questions one was the most promising as it sort of lined up well with how designers kind of viewed their design process as a whole. Writing and text in general tend to be underexplored in visualization design since we focus more on the visual parts of visualizations, which does make sense. But however, there are sort of many areas of relevant future work to explore this further. So additional work can focus on the impact of these writing rudders on the final designs. In this study, we mainly focused on those initial stages, and we did not use a typical experiment structure. So we didn't incorporate randomization or evaluation of design outcomes. This study was more exploratory in nature, just trying to get a sense of, are they used, and if so, how, and what might those impacts look like. And so we weren't really prepared for hypothesis testing with our setup, but a more controlled study that examines the impact of rudders on the storytelling in a visualization is a really important and useful next step before we really go and recommend these as broad steps for designers to take. I also mentioned earlier that sketching and wireframing are important parts of how we teach visualizations. Writing rudders may be particularly useful in this purpose as well, though a few of our more experienced participants even mentioned that they thought it would be particularly helpful for early career designers who may want more scaffolding in the visualization design process. And with LLMs and natural language interfaces becoming more prevalent, understanding writing in the design process can help inform how we leverage AI to assist in design. So designs often start like this, with this kind of blank slate, and designers figure out how to begin the process, starting with the data, what variables to look at, and how to display the information. LLMs can kind of help with this by giving you a place to start. So these writing rudders could be input for receiving design suggestions. So a designer could provide their users key questions and receive some design suggestions based on that. Now, visualization recommendations from LLMs are not likely to be incredibly high quality, but they can provide at least a starting point for a designer to evaluate approaches which may or may not work for those key questions they're trying to address and just kind of kickstart the design process. Likewise, we could use AI to generate suggestions for possible conclusions or questions. So in this way, designers may feel like they're evaluating someone else's perspective on the data rather than stating their own beliefs, which may help with this potential bias issue. So rather than seeking information to validate a claim that they think is true, they take a role closer to like a detective where they're sort of evaluating whether those possible conclusions are supported in the data. In general, writing as a component of visualization design is an interesting area of future development, and you can read more about this on my website. I am currently applying for jobs in the Chicago area. So if you are someone who's looking to fill a research role in Chicago, I would love to chat further with you. And I also want to include resources for donating to help the communities affected by both hurricanes over the past few weeks. So we have a Tampa-specific organization as well as a general organization, since people still need aid and assistance all across the southern United States. With that, I want to thank you for your time, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Chase. Well, we have quite a few questions, and there's a couple of questions that are actually centered on wondering where people were writing. Are they on sticky notes or OneNotes, or are there, sort of other kinds of ways where people, the designers you did see writing were writing?
Yeah, a great question. Thank you for that. Basically, all over. So I talked to designers who would write things in the notes app of their phone, people who use sticky notes or wrote down things physically, people who would write them in like EndNote or OneNote or like kind of systems like that. But really, a key part that came up was there was nowhere to write this kind of thing in the design itself or kind of in the tool that they were using to design it. And so they were using kind of other tools or other mechanisms to write this stuff down. And so I think it would be interesting to explore, can we give people a better, some more situated place to write these things down that can be better incorporated with the design? But to answer that question, all over really depended on kind of the personal preference of the designer.
I love that idea. Please do that and then write about it. One more really quick question. Is there a difference between writing and other methods of pre-reflection?
That's interesting. So I think one of the things that I think about with writing a lot is the kind of finding in learning studies that, writing, taking notes physically as opposed to even typing them can be more helpful for kind of internalizing that information and maintaining it in your brain. And so I think there is something kind of different about tangibly writing something down, even with pen and paper in comparison to typing. So I would say, I think other methods of pre-reflection may include like discussion with other designers, discussion with further members of the team, sort of internal reflection. A lot of times these things were happening internally, but not being externalized. And I do think there's something different about externalizing these things to use them as reference or as other mechanisms of kind of thinking through these ideas. So I do think there's something different between writing and kind of other versions of pre-reflection.
Great. Thanks, Chase. There's more questions, so please head over to Discord to engage with
Thank you.
those. All right. We are going to move on to the next speaker in today's lineup. It's going to be Hannah Bako, and she's going to be presenting a paper on unveiling how examples shape data visualization design outcomes.
Okay, can you guys see my screen okay? All right, great. Hello, everyone. I am Hannah. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland. And today I'll be presenting our paper on unveiling how examples shape visualization design outcomes. So designers are always looking for examples to inform their visualization design choices. Sorry. And these examples have the power to either improve or constrain the ideas that designers come up with during ideation. The influence of examples on creativity has actually been studied in fields such as psychology, cognitive science, engineering, and design. And these studies have revealed factors that modulate an example's influence on design outcomes. And these include when an example is introduced, the quantity as well as the quality of examples used, as well as the diversity of curated examples. But while the results of these prior work highlight, all these influential factors, their results are not readily transferable to visualization design. First, there are conflicting results for when examples should be introduced and how many examples are actually beneficial to the design process. Secondly, there are all these inherent constraints placed by data on the visualization design choices that designers make, which haven't been evaluated in any of these studies. And so in this work, we contribute an exploratory study with 32 visualization designers to understand the influence of examples on data visualization design outcomes. And we evaluate 3 research questions. First, how do the factors identified in prior studies replicate in a data visualization design context? Second, how do factors unique to visualization design influence design outcomes? And 3, how do designers actually decide which aspects of examples to incorporate into their designs? All right. And so our experiment had 4 core parts, but for this presentation, I'll just focus on the design session, but I encourage everyone to read the paper for more details on our entire protocol. So the design session replicates the seminal study protocol used by Smith et al. On studying the effects of examples on creativity. And we start with an introduction to the task and the data set, followed by a brainstorming session where designers would sketch as many design ideas as possible. The key factor we explicitly account for in our design session is when examples are introduced with 2 timing conditions. First, the start condition and also the delayed condition. In the start condition, participants were given access to stimuli examples at the beginning of the brainstorming session. In the delayed condition, participants first sketched out ideas for 15 minutes before being introduced to the stimuli examples and then sketching for the remaining 20 minutes. Both groups had about a total of 35 minutes for brainstorming. So after brainstorming, participants then selected 2 of their favorite sketches, which were then implemented by the experimenter. So from prior work, we evaluate when examples are introduced, the quantity of examples that were curated by participants, and also the diversity of the examples. We also consider other factors that are unique to visualization design, which are primarily concerned with the data topic similarity and the data schema similarity. Both of these factors measure how similar an example's dataset topic and schema are to the dataset the designer is working with. Now, in regards to design outcomes, we focus on the quantity of design sketches produced by participants, the variety of designs, which measures how distinct the designs produced by a participant are from each other. And then we also measure the number of ideas that are transferred from examples into designs. So we have our key factors for examples and the design outcomes of interest, but our participants' sketches sometimes look like this. So we had to figure out a way to describe the properties of examples and design sketches in a way that would allow us to quantitatively evaluate these factors and their influence on all these design properties. So what we did was to annotate each stimuli example and design sketch that was produced by participants, labeling, the marks, data types, visual encodings, layouts, annotations, composition, and visualization type. And so we would then use these annotated design properties to calculate metrics to compare the properties between examples and sketches. So for instance, here, the data type could be used to derive the data schema similarity, and the marks, layout, annotations, and compositions could be used to calculate the diversity of curated examples or the variety of design sketches. So our main findings. For the quantitative analysis, we found that a delayed introduction of examples leads to participants curating examples with data topics that are less similar to the data set that they're working on. And it would also lead to an increase in the quantity and variety of designs produced by participants. And these actually confirm the results of prior work, which shows that a delay in introducing examples is more effective at improving the number of ideas produced while problem solving. Additionally, participants who curate examples that have closer schema similarity to the data set that they're working on are actually more likely to copy ideas from those examples into their visualization designs. Our study also had a think aloud protocol, and since we're interested in understanding why and how designers would incorporate ideas from examples, we performed a qualitative evaluation of their thought process during the experiment. And the main thing we synthesized from this is that, contrary to our initial assumption of data being the most constraining influence on designers' design choices, we actually have 4 additional factors that designers describe as influential to their decisions on whether or not they should incorporate ideas from examples. These include the visualization task, of course, design priors, which are prior design ideas that they had in mind before they began brainstorming, and also the composition and complexity of the designs that were presented in the example. And so what are the implications of our findings? Well, first, for designers, we find that design quantity and variety can be enhanced with a timed introduction of examples. So designers and educators can improve the design outcomes by delaying the use of examples until after an initial brainstorming session has been had. Secondly, designers need to evaluate the interaction between data compatibility, visualization components, and design complexity before using examples. So in our study, we implemented participants' selected sketches. Out of the 64 designs that were selected, 7 of them were infeasible, primarily due to mismatches between the intended visualization form and the data that they were working on. So here we have 2 examples of some of these infeasible designs. And the first one, the user was trying to include data that was not presented, that was not present in the data set that they were provided with. While in the second one, the designer was attempting to create a Sankey diagram with incompatible data. And these types of issues repeatedly occurred, and they can easily be mitigated by careful consideration before committing to using designs. So our results also have key implications for research. First, this work presents an exploratory investigation. More work is needed to confirm our findings for each of these factors that we identified. For our study, we also developed metrics to quantify the properties of examples and design sketches. However, we found during our, when trying to come up with labels for all of these properties, that the literature lacks clear guidance on creating such metrics, and there are no comprehensive taxonomies for describing the properties of visualization designs. So while the metrics we created for this are sufficient for this study, there's a need for more systematic research to define the various dimensions of visualization designs, particularly layouts. Also, we need to developing metrics to measure the diversity of a set of visualization designs is also an interesting research direction. Finally, our study focuses on only a single iteration of the design process. Future work can consider a longer-term study of the design process, looking at how examples influence design outcomes across the different design stages. So in summary, we sought to understand the influence of examples on data visualization design outcomes. We identified 6 core factors that modulate an example's influence on design outcomes and designers' decisions to use examples. Here I have a sample of some of the interesting designs that participants selected and we implemented. You can scan the QR code to see the gallery of all the implemented designs on our OSF repository. I would like to say a big thank you to all my collaborators. I'm also on the academic job market this year looking for postdocs and tenure track positions. So please scan the QR code to learn more about my work, and I'm ready to take questions.
Thank you so much, Hannah. One question for you is around these examples seem to really be focusing on the various ways that you can encode data. And I'm sort of curious if you think that there's the potential for introducing examples to perhaps have people think more broadly about visualization aesthetics. I'm thinking about, perhaps moving away from just considering these sort of statistical charts, and if you think that's a sort of possibility with this.
Yes, it's actually something I would love to see, because, generally, so for context, this is actually a follow-up study to an interview study that was presented in 2022. And we found that one of the things that designers look for is they're looking for these new representations, right? What else is different outside of, bar charts and line charts and scatter plots? What else can I create? And so examples are primarily to guide designers to figure out what is possible. But I don't think there are sufficient tools right now that really help them figure that out, like whether it's recommenders or search engines. What the things that are produced are kind of limited to, the core basic charts. And so for you to find more aesthetic, I guess, designs that are more lenient on the aesthetic side, you have to actually know what to look for, and you have to go to like specific sites to look for those things. But a lot of people just don't know where to even go to begin to start searching for these things. So I think there's definitely a lot of space for research in that direction.
Cool. And one more really quick question, sort of along the same lines. Do you think it's desirable to have diverse designs, or is it possible that they are detours down alleys that won't lead anywhere?
I think so. So I think there's like this tension of trying to show people as many designs as possible, like what is possible with the data they're working with, or, around that space. But the challenge there then becomes there's all these other things that you also have to account for, right? It could be an interesting design, but it may not work with the data that they're working with. It could be an interesting design, but it may not necessarily be suitable for like how they're going to present it, whether they're presenting it on a web interface or a PDF, or it's going out in an email. There are all these different technical and social technical factors that need to be accounted for. So I would say like it's an interesting area for future work, to be honest.
Great. We look forward to seeing more studies from you about this. Thank you so much. Okay, so the next talk in this session is going to be from Sarah Schöttler. And she is going to be presenting the paper Practices and Strategies in Responsive Thematic Map Design, a report from design workshops with experts.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Sarah Schöttler, and this is work with my supervisors, Uta Hinrichs and Benjamin Bach. I'm a fourth year student at the University of Edinburgh, and yeah, let's jump right in. So responsive visualization is becoming more important, and like all digital content, visualizations are being consumed on more and more different devices with different screen sizes, different interaction modalities. And in visualization, there's been lots of great work in the last couple of years on design strategies, guidance, and tools for responsive visualization. Just one example are the design patterns by Kim et al., who developed these based on surveying hundreds of published visualizations. But thematic maps have specific challenges in the context of responsive design. Maps typically have fixed aspect ratios that you can't really adjust easily. They have lots of complex shapes of varying density. So for example, on world maps, Europe is often difficult because it has lots of comparably small countries that you still want to somehow stay visible. And they have very specific layout requirements where you can't just kind of rearrange parts of the map. This results in many responsive visualization design strategies not really being applicable to maps. For example, you don't really want to rotate a map. You also can't really scale the axes independently of each other. And removing records also isn't that helpful, because if you filter out, for example, small values, you have less information on the screen, but you can't really use it that much because you can't rearrange the other items to use that space like you could if you, for example, remove 10 bars out of a bar chart. So the aim of this work is to fill this gap by identifying challenges, strategies, and specific design solutions for responsive thematic mapping. We initially conducted 3 expert interviews that I'm not going to cover in detail now, but you can find more about this in the paper. And based on insights from these interviews, we then developed a one-on-one design workshop format, which we ran with 8 visualization and thematic map designers and developers. In these workshops, we met participants online for about an hour, and we used a Miro board, which is sort of an online collaborative whiteboarding tool if you're not familiar. And each participant initially got one of these 2 maps. So 4 participants got a proportional circle map of global population by country, and the other 4 participants got a choropleth map showing the election results in the UK in 2019. And this is what the Miro board looked like in the beginning of the workshop. So we gave them this rectangle grid where the largest rectangle was kind of meant to symbolize a laptop screen size. And in the largest rectangle, we put one of these 2 maps that they were given. And then the other rectangles, some of them represent common display sizes. So for example, laptop screens, tablet screens, smartphone screens are all labeled, but we also included lots of in-between sizes that are maybe less common as devices, but we wanted to kind of encourage designers to gradually redesign things to adjust to all of these different screen sizes. Here's one example of what that looked like at the end of the workshop. You can see that participants duplicated and cropped images. They could use shapes, paste images from the internet, and they also used lots of sticky notes to kind of explain things that were hard to create on Miro or to explain interactive features that they couldn't prototype. After these 8 workshops, we then classified and tallied up all of the different techniques that participants used to adjust their visualization designs. We found a really clear hierarchy in how these techniques were applied and grouped them into 4 groups where participants started with subtle design changes. Then they used things like scrolling, zooming, and panning. Then some segmented the map, and then finally, as sort of a last resort, they used alternative visualization types. And I'm going to give some examples from each of these 4 categories for specific techniques that they used. Examples of subtle design changes are things like adjusting outlines, so making outlines thinner or removing outlines entirely. Another example is repositioning UI elements, so not really changing the map itself, but rearranging things around the map to have more space or a more suitable aspect ratio for the map. And another example is changing the map projection, which isn't always possible, but can sometimes help to sort of tweak the aspect ratio a little bit. Once they had kind of exhausted the subtle design changes and hadn't really managed to solve the challenges on some screen sizes, they moved on to scrolling, zooming, and panning. So this can be scrolling vertically or scrolling horizontally, or it can be pan and zoom, where you can interact with a map the same way that you would on, say, Google Maps. And a third option is using cutouts for dense areas. So for example, on maps of the UK, London is often a much denser area than the rest of the map. So while the rest of the map might be fine, the London area would be difficult to read. So then you can create a little zoomed in cutout for that area. The third group of techniques is segmenting the map. We found 2 different ways in which participants did this. They either used equally sized segments where they just kind of used a straight line to cut the map in half or to cut it into 3 parts, and then they rearranged those segments to better suit the aspect ratio of the rectangle or screen that they were targeting. The other option is to use geographic subunits. So for example, on a world map, you could separate it into continents and then rearrange the continents however you want to match your screen that you want to display this on. And then finally, there are alternative visualization types. This can be cartograms and grid maps, which stay quite close to maps, but do remove a lot of geographic detail. It can also be non-geographic visualizations like tree maps or bar charts. Sometimes you can maintain a little bit of geographic detail, for example, by arranging a tree map to kind of loosely represent the geography. And then finally, as a last resort for very small screens, some people remove visualizations entirely and replace them with, for example, a table or a search box. Some final thoughts. The sandbox one-on-one design workshop format was really great for learning from practitioners. It allowed us to see them make a lot of design decisions in a really short time. And it gave us control over kind of real world constraints, such as a lack of tool support for certain techniques and time and budget pressures that might usually prevent them from using certain design ideas that they have. And we were expecting some overlap between strategies. We were hoping for some overlap, but we were surprised at how much there was, especially for strategies that are rarely seen in published visualizations, like segmenting maps. There were multiple participants using all of these techniques, despite sort of a perceived lack of best practices. So while using these techniques, multiple participants expressed that they were unsure if this was actually a good idea, and they suggested that others might think this was a bad design choice, but at the same time, multiple participants were actually making these choices in parallel. And then we were also surprised at how clear this hierarchy of strategies was. Tool support does remain a challenge because a lot of these techniques that we suggest are currently relatively challenging to implement. And also user studies could definitely help to evaluate some of these specific techniques and to also create more detailed design guidance for how to apply these techniques. For example, how many segments is appropriate when segmenting a map. We compiled all of these design solutions together with an overview of challenges into a responsive map cheat sheet, which you can download using the QR code or the link on the screen. And in a little case study, one participant said that it was really, really helpful. So hopefully some of you find it helpful too. And that's all from me. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Sarah. One question here is, how do the design changes made for responsive maps differ from other visualization types? Do you think there's takeaways that are more broadly applicable from this?
Yeah, so essentially there's just a lot more constraints with maps. So you can probably apply some of these techniques to other visualizations that aren't maps. I think it might be most useful for other kind of more complex visualization types. So these techniques probably aren't super useful for bar charts. There's better techniques out there. But for example, network visualizations, things like adjacency matrices that also have a lot of kind of constraints on aspect ratio and kind of the layout, this might be a starting point for finding techniques for those types of visualizations.
Thanks. And one more question. You mentioned in the sort of challenges, the sort of technical constraints of working with maps generally. I'm wondering if you have any sense about if those technical constraints were gone, do you think you might see more variability? And here I'm just wondering if people are able to sketch, and what do you think the constraints of the technology do on people's sort of thinking broadly here?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think we would definitely see a lot more different map designs if the tools were better, because the tool constraints already start at the prototyping stage. So in those interviews, one of the participants basically said it's impossible to work with maps in Figma because as soon as you paste those complex shapes in there, it gets so slow that you can't work with it anymore. So you can't even really prototype designs, and implementing maps is also much harder than implementing other visualizations. So for maps, maybe more than for other visualizations, there's very much sort of the maps that we see are very much determined by what the tools kind of make easy. And everything that's difficult to do is going to be much less common because it's really difficult to achieve. So yeah, I think if we had better tools for maps that were kind of less focused on kind of all maps look this very particular way and have this very particular way of interacting with it as well, we could see some really cool map designs in the future.
Sounds like a really great call to action for the community right there. So thanks for that. Great. All right. We are going to be moving on to the next talk. Next in the session is going to be Jonathan Roberts. And he is going to be presenting on a paper, Path-Based Design Model for Constructing and Exploring Alternative Visualizations.
Okay, thanks very much. So yeah, can you see my slides okay? I'm taking a blank as being. So I'm going to be talking about path-based design.
We don't see your slides yet.
You don't? You do?
I do not.
All right, there you go.
Yep, thanks.
That's better. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about this idea of a path-based design model with the aim to construct and explore different alternative visualization designs. So we can imagine that we have sketching, and I've been doing a lot of sketching of people and humans. And one of the techniques when you're sketching is to lay down these line of actions. The idea is that they're much more the fluidity of the person or the representation that you're trying to create is much more fluid, is more emotional. You're capturing the emotion of that human being. Now, these lines of actions sort of flow through the design space. Now, the idea is that can we use some of this idea of sort of doing some skeleton lines, some lines of action to then help drive forward and design alternatives within visualization. So what we're presenting here is this skeleton or a flow graph, which we then can encode parameters and different aspects of the visualization pipeline onto this flow graph. We can hook these things onto that, encoding it, all of these parameters as a gene, and then we could start to swap in and out different alternative values to create these alternate visualizations, like textures. You can obviously change the path, you can change the symbols. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. So we make 4 contributions. In the paper, we go into much more detail. This Xinyi, this creation system that we've put together, which is a component library, a renderer, builder applications, so forth. There's lots of different parts. In this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the model and then give a demonstration of Xinyi, but there's much more detail of the other component parts in the paper. So let's have a very simple overview and an example. So if we create a path, the path is a series of vertices. On those series of vertices, that can be through any space that we're going to define. So in this case, we've just got a line going up and a line going down, which is going to be our angular type of a bar for our bar chart. On that, we're going to define an envelope. This envelope gives us the rendering area or our sort of window of opportunity. If you're doing it for a small screen or a mobile or a watch or something, you can define that to be what you're going to be rendered within. Then we're going to be placing objects onto that. These are general objects. In this case, we've got some rectangles, but they could be any marks that you want to place. These are placed between those vertices of our path. This is a dual. We decided to put them between, but they could be on the points, but our design space has them between on the edges. So we place these objects on the edges, and then we can map those to data. So the values within our data space, or change their visualization. So mapping both size and color in this case. So we can do these simple paths. This is just a up, down, angular. But we also got this idea of a jump. So we can define a jump within the path. This means that although the path is continuous in that space, it doesn't look like it's necessarily contiguous. So that means we can jump around and we can do zigzags and sort of returns and things like that, which allows us to control the path. We've got in our tool, we can use a control paths that we can sort of choose. We've got a little drawing editor. But also we've got this idea that we're wanting to do space filling paths or specific type of paths like rings and continuous and spirals and golden ratios and things. And the space filling paths are interesting because it allows you to put into that sort of visualization, the design, some predetermined way of putting the information down, such as a Hilbert space filling curve tries to put things together that are close in that linear space. So we can start define and change and mix some of these parameters. By controlling these, we were then allowing to create different and alternative visualizations. So we've all got the path already. We've got the objects we're placing on the path. These are 2 parts of our gene. We can swap those in and out, but it can also change how we're planning and placing those objects onto the path, whether it's above, whether it's below, whether it's whatever. So that means when it returns, it can be upside down or to the left or roundabout. So here's the sort of way to recreate. So we can recreate a path on the same place. We've got the same path. We place an object, and then we can start to intersect those 2 objects to create a sort of smooth stream flow or stream graph. Obviously, there's different ways to create objects and visualizations. So we can imagine that there's 2 different ways to create such a scatter plot. We either define them in data or in x-axis order, or we can define them in data space order. And there's different ways that would allow us to create visualizations in that way. The same with sort of circular plots. We can either create a circular path. This will give us like this sort of star plot type thing, or we can put circular objects onto a linear path to get something sort of similar in that design space. So you can start to imagine that there's different ways to create same visualizations. Same visualizations will be created by different types of paths and ways of doing it, or vice versa. Different visualizations can be created in different ways. In the paper, we go into a little bit more detail over creating these visualizations and recreating different people's visualizations. But let me move on to the tool. So this is sort of the headline of the Xinyi tool. The builder has 3 main parts, has a drag and drop area, has the gene area in the middle, and then a canvas that we can drag to. So let me just play the video a little bit and try and talk to it. So at the moment, we've got on the left-hand side, we're going to choose and select a particular path. In this case, we're going to choose a type of path, and we're going to add some properties. We can have a new gene. So let's have a new gene. And in that, we're going to have a Hilbert space, a Hilbert path, an H curve. This is a defined path, but as I said, we can create our own paths. On that, we're going to add in a circle, some circle shapes. And we're going to take those from data. So in this case, the data is going to derive and change how those are mapped. We're going to have them evenly displaced. Not going to choose an object rotation or a filtering in this case, but we are going to choose a data set, drag into that. That will give us a particular gene with a definition. And now we're showing that H path, that Hilbert space within that visualization. That gives us one instance of it. Now maybe we want to change that to square. Straight away, we get a different square and we get a new visualization, an alternative of that same visualization path. We cloned it as you probably saw, and now we're going to use triangles or change it to some sort of hump or different aspect of it. So in this way, we're just experimenting, we're changing, we're adapting the things. Here we're doing a radial, something circular. And by changing these parameters, by changing the values we have within our paths, we are allowing ourselves to explore different alternatives and alternate designs. In this example, we've sort of constrained the envelope that we're having into these sort of square blocks, but we can change this domain within the system. So there you go. There's a sort of a whole bunch of visualizations that you've explored through different parameter changes that have happened quite quickly. Let me move on. So in the paper, as I said, there's many other parts, much more detail about the component library, about the renderer, and you can go and get and have a play with this at the Xinyi GitHub place. So that's really it. That gives you an insight of what we've built, this idea of this path-based model. The model has a lot of definitions within the paper. And yeah, and have a play, go and explore. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jonathan. Couple questions for you. First one, have you considered glyph occlusion on the inside of a tight curve and how that might be mitigated?
So absolutely right. There are things that you can create that perhaps you don't want to create. And so when you're putting those sort of objects down, they may occlude each other from the next part of the path. We have a filtering mechanism that you can do something with that. You can either add them together, unite them, intersect them as well. And that is actually useful part and parcel of the design. But you're absolutely right. There may be some circumstances that you're creating these things and they don't want to be overlapping, but that can be also a side effect that could be positive.
Great. Another question is, how expressive do you think this approach is, for example, compared to something like Vega Light?
All systems, I guess, have their limitations. And I think, I mean, the idea here, by expressing it into a gene, it does allow you to very quickly just sort of swap in and out these ideas. So yeah, I think the expressiveness, the model is much more expressive than perhaps the system, our implementation is. There's many more possibilities that we can do, and the model is quite explicit in the paper. So yeah, I think by doing this, I think you can encode some really quite creative visualizations.
And one more question, sort of along those lines, I can't help but think about links to the work that Hannah presented earlier on using designs. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on your model applied to the kinds of findings she has.
Well, I have to look much more into detail of that paper about the findings specifically, but no, I mean, the idea is I thought this session was really interesting because there's a lot of overlap between some of the ideas going on there, the expressiveness of the drawing and the sketching when the earlier. Absolutely. So yeah, I think there's move or merge these techniques together definitely is one way of doing it.
Kudos to the program committee for giving us a great session.
Absolutely. Brilliant.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We're going to move on to the next speaker. So next is going to be Anjana Arunkumar, and she is going to be talking about the paper Mind Drifts, Data Shifts, utilizing mind wandering to track the evolution of user experience with data visualizations.
Thank you for the introduction. So, hi everyone, I'm Anjana, and I'm a postdoc at Northeastern University working with Padilla. So I'll be presenting our paper, Mind Drifts Data Shifts today. So let's start off with a very quick experiment. Take a look at this visualization for 10 seconds. Now, how many of you can honestly say that you only engaged in interpreting the visualization the entire time that you just looked at it? That is, were you 100% focused? Or did you think about other things? Say something sort of related to the chart, like maybe birds that you've seen around recently. Or maybe something completely irrelevant, like how you wanted to check your email. Well, if either of these things happened, then you were basically mind wandering. So formally, mind wandering is defined as unconscious shifts in attention away from the primary task or stimuli towards either relevant internal thoughts, here that's tangentially referencing the chart's appearance, data, or overall topic, or completely irrelevant thoughts, which here again is something that isn't directly related to the chart at all. Now, before I go any further into describing what the experiment and the results and stuff look like, let me take a step back to answer why looking at mind wandering matters in the first place in the context of visualization. So firstly, prior work has shown that mind wandering often involves visual imagery, and this can very significantly impact memory consolidation and recall in a negative manner. And next, the traditional evaluations of visualizations at large rely very heavily on collecting reports post-viewing from the users, but that might not accurately reflect their actual experience because of fluctuations in their engagement while they're looking at something. And as for current dynamic measures, so we have eye tracking as a proxy for visual attention, but that doesn't necessarily indicate if somebody's actively processing to make sense of the information. And in think aloud protocols, viewers can narrate their reasoning in real time while viewing the stimuli, but that kind of continuous verbalization can make them self-conscious and alter their natural cognitive processes. So in contrast, mind wandering could potentially allow researchers to explore dynamic fluctuations in attention and engagement without explicitly interrupting the user's natural interaction with the visualization. So we use a set of 100 real-world communicative visualizations, which were extensively pre-coded using the visual taxonomy developed by Borkin et al. And we recruit graduate students to complete a 3-phase study. So first, we present participants with a diverse set of real-world visualizations, and after 3 seconds of viewing, we assess their initial understanding. In the next phase, participants view each stimulus for 45 seconds, and during the observation period, they're asked to self-report instances of mind wandering. And this was basically done via key press to indicate the occurrence and type of mind wandering as a self-caught probe. And this is in line with current techniques that are used in psychology to study this phenomenon. As part of the pre-study training, the participants are explicitly instructed and they complete test trials to ensure that they understand what exactly constitutes mind wandering, as well as how to differentiate between the different types. Post-viewing, we collect Likert ratings using previously validated metrics for post-viewing. And we also ask participants to verbalize their impressions of the visualization using adjectives. And these are transformed into 2D vectors based on the strength and valence of the terms used. For short-term recall, we also elicit and code this as vectors based on the mention of different design elements, personal opinions, or trends in the recall. Finally, 1 week later, in the last phase, we test their long-term recall using a visual recognition task on the stimuli set. So we explored 3 primary research questions in this context. Firstly, does mind wandering play a role at all in shaping the viewer experience? And next, how do the different design elements impact mind wandering patterns that may be exhibited? And finally, can mind wandering possibly serve as a mediator? That is, can it explain why when you encounter certain design elements, you can sort of predict what the user reaction or levels of different ratings in the post-viewing measures might be as an expert? So we use structural equation modeling to examine this interplay, and we have several interesting results throughout the paper. But in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on the main findings, and I encourage you to look at the paper to see the rest. So firstly, as a teaser, here are the visualizations associated with the highest level volumes of mind wanderings across the different types. So appearance, data, and topic related thoughts are relevant to the chart, and irrelevant or unrelated thoughts is the last one. Drilling down into what the finer details of the effects are. So overall, we find that both relevant and irrelevant mind wandering significantly impact most of the post-viewing measures, except for long-term recall. And higher frequencies of mind wandering, as well as when it happens earlier in the observation period, those inflate the effects that are seen when disrupting different post-viewing ratings. Second, people exhibit less frequent mind wandering when they look at charts that they are able to understand at a glance. And we conjecture that maybe an increased sense of familiarity with these kinds of charts might prime viewers to focus and engage consistently throughout the observation period. Measures that rely on cognitive mechanisms are in general negatively mediated, while those that rely on affective mechanisms are positively mediated by mind wandering. And the way that cognitive and affective engagement are rated follow the same patterns. So for example, take this chart. So people experience less mind wandering. They're also able to easily recall the main takeaway pretty accurately. And their trust in the chart as well as their interpretation of it is higher. So this chart's also considered to be very efficiently designed for communication. And there's explicit mention of the title element and the legend simplifying understanding. On the other hand, this chart, where a lot of mind wandering is seen, the usage of bird images as well as these icon areas to represent information trends leads to an increase in mind wandering, but results in higher emotional response. This chart's also considered to have a much higher quality aesthetic than the other one, with the usage of unique or novel stylistic elements getting appreciated. Looking at the common types of mind wandering related to these kinds of archetypes. So the charts with higher cognitive engagement lead to more relevant mind wandering based on the topic or data. And the charts with higher affective engagement lead to predominantly irrelevant mind wandering, sometimes followed by either topic or appearance related thoughts, but that kind of depends on how much text is present in the chart. And when we look at text by itself, when you have very, very high text volumes in the chart, it causes a lot of mind wandering to occur towards the end of that 45-second viewing period, seemingly pretty much once people just run out of things to be reading on the chart in the first place. So all this indicates that possibly a viewer might experience an emotional response to a visualization, even without actively analyzing the data, due to deeper introspection that's prompted by relevant mind wandering. But on the other hand, any sort of cognitive measure that involves effortful mental processing is significantly disrupted, particularly when the mind wandering is completely unrelated to what the chart is saying. Indeed, we find that the charts that are closer in structure to what you might expect as a canonical impression a person might hold for a particular chart type experiences less mind wandering than those with very high levels of embellishment. So therefore, to summarize, we offer quantitative evidence that supports how mind wandering functions as a dynamic measure of the viewer experience with data visualizations. And in particular, we find that redundancy and high annotation reduce mind wandering, preventing cognitive overload. But having very high text or visual novelty elements impacts the type and timing of mind wandering, often leading to irrelevant thoughts. And to kind of manage this effect of visual density, we can use familiar structural elements like axes and legends and have high data ink ratios. So overall, understanding how the different design elements influence mind wandering essentially allows us to contextualize the robustness of what we're collecting post-viewing and potentially use this to optimize visualizations for deeper engagement and more effective processing. And the goal is to ultimately improve the overall viewer experience. So to quickly summarize what we intend to do in the future. So firstly, since mind wandering was self-reported, there may be some bias, though participants were extensively pre-trained. So future work could validate using physiological measures like pupil dilation for more accuracy. And secondly, the observation period here is only 45 seconds, which might not necessarily reflect the viewing experience in a long-term period. Say you spend 5 or 10 minutes with the chart instead. So extending the study to cover this kind of phenomena will better help inform the design of interventions like animation or interactions that could maintain cognitive and emotional focus consistently for a very natural viewing experience period across different sets of users. And that's pretty much it. Thank you for listening. And I also just wanted to put out that I'm currently on the job market and I'm specifically looking for tenure track positions in academia. And now I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. One question is you talk about how in your study you looked at the effects of visual encodings on mind wandering. I'm wondering if you can say anything about the effects of mind wandering on someone's interpretation. And here I'm sort of interested if, you know, if people are thinking about different kinds of things, does that impact the kinds of ways that they're interpreting what they see?
So, I mean, part of that question can be answered by looking at the short-term recall. So basically, the way that we directed like people reporting recall was like state what your takeaway is and then say whatever else you remember about the chart. So basically what happened very quickly was the more mind wandering they experience, especially if it's towards the start of the period, their descriptions become less and less specific. So they're just like, I remember seeing the color red, but they won't tell you what's red. They won't tell you what red means. They won't tell you a data value. And that's technically relevant to the appearance, but the quality and the specificity goes way down. So basically, where it's hitting people in terms of interpretation is more to do with how fine-grained is their recall beyond like what the overall summary is.
Great. And one more really quick question. How good are people at indicating their mind wandering? In your example up front, I found it very difficult to, you know, think about what I was doing as my mind was wandering.
So I would say that they're good at distinguishing when it's between relevant and irrelevant. We had to go through several training trials to make sure that they were able to distinguish like what is topic relevant and what is data relevant in particular. Because we found that a lot of people are just like, oh, the topic means it's the title. So if there's a title and I think about something related to the title, fine, that's topic. But it's not always topic. It's sometimes relevant to the legend or the data, and they're just misclassifying it. So there are certain nuances that are more difficult to train them for. But once they're sufficiently trained, like this experiment wasn't very difficult once they were like very clear on what the different types constitute.
Great, thank you so much. All right, we are going to move on to the last talk in this session, which is going to be given by Astrid van de Brandt. And she is going to be talking about understanding visualization authoring techniques for genomics data in the context of personas and tasks.
Okay, thank you for introducing me. Do you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Astrid. I'm a PhD student at Eindhoven University of Technology. And today, on behalf of my colleagues from Eindhoven and Harvard Medical School, I present our work on understanding visualization authoring for genomics data. So visualization authoring is actually a very common task, and probably everyone has authored a visualization at some point in their life. For example, with Excel, mapping columns to a bar chart. So generally, authoring is the process in which raw data is transformed and rendered to views, and the user may be involved in different stages during this construction. In data-intensive fields such as genomics, experts need to create many different visualizations to make sense of their data. And more importantly, we see that these typically go beyond standard bar charts. For example, a custom visualization in genomics is to visualize reads mapping to a reference. And for non-technical individuals or novices, this might already be very challenging because we have to compute a coverage score, and many of these reads have to be plotted as intervals. This is just one example, but authoring in this field is very challenging, typically because of several reasons. There are very large data sets that have multiple levels of detail and uncertainty. There are very diverse data questions, and typically the visualization will be part of the research outcome as well. And lastly, the possible design space can also be complex and is just large. So visualization authoring in genomics is really essential to make sense of their complex data, but it's not well understood and never actually really looked at. So that raised our research question: which visualization authoring technique can best support a diverse group of genomics experts, and in which tasks? To answer this question, we conducted 2 user studies. We first conducted semi-structured interviews with 20 diverse experts. We coded those results to understand the current situation. And then we wanted to explore further how ideally people want to author in an exploratory study with visual design probes. So first, about the diverse group. From previous studies, we know that user and contextual characteristics actually impact the type of tooling that people need. So therefore, we wanted to reach a diverse group of experts. We used multiple channels for this to reach people from different types of organizations. And it turns out that these experts have very broad backgrounds and skill sets in programming, data manipulation, and visualization. And to understand this diversity a little bit better, we also mapped these participants to existing personas in bioinformatics and data science based on our insights of study 1. We actually found 5 personas that can represent these diverse users in genomics authoring. And we categorized these using 3 additional dimensions: the focus of their study, the level of automation in their work, and the audience. So, for example, biologists tend to focus more on biological questions, have low levels of automation, and author primarily for themselves. One of the aspects we also looked at was the tools that were used in their workflows. And here we see that biologists tend to have more of a linear process and have challenges in usability and effectiveness of GUI tools. Whereas bioinformaticians use more coding approaches and therefore also express challenges related to learning complex coding languages. So then about the tasks. For this study, we defined visualization authoring quite broadly as design and implementation of data visualizations involving decisions on data, visual encodings, and composition. But to understand really the challenges that these authors face, we felt like we needed to know a little bit more about low-level authoring tasks. And to do so, we reviewed some related work in visualization taxonomies and task classifications. And we used that to outline several of these lower level tasks, possibly for genomics data. So after our interviews from study 1, we found that some tasks were indeed highlighted, but for many others, it's still unclear how the users in the genomics domain actually perceive them and if they're even supported in these tools. So this also motivated us to have a closer look at these tasks and also the authoring techniques in the second study. So for the authoring techniques, we also reviewed work outside of genomics that studies various authoring interfaces. And typically these have trade-offs in the strengths and weaknesses. For example, in template-based techniques, users select from a predefined template to visualize, and in shelf configuration, users can use drag and drop interactions to bind data to visual encodings. And these are easy to use, but maybe are limited in creating highly custom visualizations. Then natural language interfaces take user prompt as natural language for input. Example-based techniques let users specify their intent with a sketch or an image. And visualization by demonstration allows users to use direct manipulation of graphical elements. And these techniques provide users with more intuitive interactions, but tend to be less accurate compared to others. Then lastly, there's code editing, which is likely more expressive, but comes with a steep learning curve. So in the genomics field, a few of these techniques have been adopted, but many others, for many others, is unclear. So this leaves actually opportunities for these other techniques, which we wanted to explore in our second study. So in the second study, we wanted to look how authors ideally visualize and also with techniques outside of the ones that they know. And to do this, we used design probes inspired by the work of Anna Krzan and colleagues, where we first trained our participants on all of these authoring techniques. And then we had them show and tell us how they would use it in the main session. And here are some of the insights. So in this figure, we summarize the authoring techniques that we looked at and the preferences for our participants. Per persona, these are the rows, and then also across the tasks, which are the columns. And first of all, I also want to note that, yeah, we see just broad diversity in the answers, but we didn't really get a clear pattern, but I can point out a few interesting things. So overall, the tasks, we see that no single technique was really preferred. And overall, the tasks and all the personas, we see that coding here in orange was seen as an overall good option, as well as natural language input in pink. And for changing the visualization type here in blue, template seems to be most preferred. For persona-specific things, we noticed that software engineers didn't really reflect on the use of shelves for creation and customization, and probably we think that might be because they are familiar with other more expressive techniques. We also gathered some reflections on the usefulness of authoring techniques, and one in particular was about natural language input, where some participants noticed that it can be difficult to describe what they really want to achieve with natural language, indicating that it might not always be the most natural way to do it. So, for example, this could happen when describing a custom visualization that doesn't really have a clear name. So we think this should be taken into account when using language models, that there might not always be clear understanding of the target visualization. And last but not least, we developed 5 design implications, and I'll highlight a few here. So the first is to combine techniques for better expressiveness and learnability. Because in our work, we find that people don't really stick to one single technique, and they have various reasons to do so. So, for example, they indicated that they wanted to learn more advanced techniques, or they just wanted to leverage the best of both worlds. And I also wanted to point out that this is actually explored in a paper led by Sehi that was presented yesterday. Another implication we found is to have guidance in creating multiple linked views. because we understand from our participants that interactivity, such as brushing and linking, is really important, but often just too challenging to implement. So we think that future authoring interfaces can help in this, maybe by automatically linking views with shared properties. So to conclude, we started with the question, how does a diverse group of authors author visualization? What are the tasks that they perform, and what are techniques that can best support them? And we understand this a little bit better now. So genomics experts author very regularly and have diverse ways of doing it. We have some initial understanding about the task and user-specific challenges, but we also realized that more in-depth study is still needed to get more definite conclusions. And that was my talk. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Astrid. One question I have is actually, related to something that Sarah talked about in her talk as well, which was the constraints of technology on what people were able to do, even if they wanted to sort of be more expressive. And I'm wondering if there are some specific things about genomics data and the sort of complexity of the data and the visualizations that you think are being hindered by the technology that they have today.
Yeah, I think what we also frequently found from our study participants is that since they have to work with very large data sets, they are often running on a server or something like that, not even on their local computer. And yeah, not having that in the same context already very much complicates things for them. And then they stick to some standard tools that are available on the server, but don't necessarily serve them best.
And one more question. You mentioned guidance as being specific to linking views. Did you find guidance needed in other phases as well?
I think maybe it was most apparent for using interaction, but I think we also saw that some people expressed a need for exploring a little bit more design alternatives. So I think in that phase, maybe some guidance could also be helpful especially for the personas that didn't do this or maybe are not so aware of it.
And one last quick question. How specific do you think these findings are to genomics experts, and do you think they might extrapolate to other domains?
Yeah, I think since we ran this all with genomics experts, definitely for them would be useful for tool builders for this, but I think it could also be useful for adjacent fields that are also very data intensive, or adjacent biological fields such as single cell analysis. Where you have also maybe diverse authors, personas, and they have to deal with this complexity of the data.
Great, thanks so much. That is the end of this session. For folks out there hiring people, the students on this channel are looking for jobs, so please reach out. They all had some really excellent work here. So thanks again to the presenters and to everyone who tuned in. Bye.